So in this context, I've been interested in the controversy on the representation of production in growth models between what we could call natural resources economics and ecological economics, which has basically started in the early 70s and has been revived by the late 90s and has never been really closed since then. So by natural resources economics, I mean the neoclassical version of the growth theory with exhaustible resources, and in particular the work of Robert Solow and Joseph Stiglitz, who have set the foundations of this approach in the early 70s. And on the side of ecological economics, Nicolas Georgescu-Roegen argued that this representation of production was not consistent with thermodynamic laws, and later Herman Daly in 1997 revived his criticism and triggered a direct confrontation between natural resources economics and ecological economics, which we will talk later. So I'm interested in analyzing the fundamental concept of both paradigms and the methodological foundations on which they rely. Since it's a short presentation, I will try to go to the essential, but be as clear as possible. And so I will first present Solow's and Stiglitz models, then Georgescu-Roegen's criticism of their representation of production, and finish with the debate of 1997. So starting with Solow and Stiglitz, Robert Solow's address to the American Economic Association in December 1973 reminds us of how the story begins. So basically, it's the report on the limits to growth that triggered his interest for natural resources, and he decided he ought to find out what economic theory has to say about the problems connected with exhaustible resources. So his work and that of Joseph Stiglitz were published in 1974, and they rely on the framework of the neoclassical growth theory, which was developed in 1956 by Solow himself, and which relies where the production is represented with a production function. We have had talks before on the subject. So basically it's a relation between the level of output and the level of the factors of production, and where traditionally in growth theory only aggregate capital K and labor L were considered as relevant factors of production, natural resources economics introduced the flow of resources R in the production function, which held this form. And so resources under interest are either energy resources or even minerals, but the important fact is that they be exhaustible and taken from a finite stock. And the goal of Solow and Stiglitz is to know if an hypothetical economy represented by this kind of model can achieve a constant consumption per head across generations without exhausting the total stock of resources. So if we go further into the specifications of the production function, we come across this assumption of unbounded resources productivity, which Solow explains that the interesting case is one in which R equals 0 entails that Q equals 0, but that the average product of R has no upper bound, which I call unbounded resources productivity. And so, as we see here, the interest of, well, this assumption is mainly motivated by concerns of mathematical concerns of avoiding trivial cases where the answer to the initial problem is obviously positive or obviously negative. And this assumption of unbounded resources productivity will be at the center of the controversy with ecological economics. So, with this common assumption, Solow and Stiglitz will explore the slightly different cases with slightly different specification of production functions. So, for example, Solow considers the case of a constant population and with no technical progress, where he uses the Cobb-Douglas production function with this form. So here, unbounded resources productivity is mainly achieved by the substitutability of capital to resources, which mathematically means that the ratio Q over R can grow indefinitely provided that K is large enough. On his side, Stiglitz considers the case of a growing population at a constant rate, and he introduces technical progress with an exponential term, which yields and uses otherwise a similar Cobb-Douglas production function. So he has this kind of function. And now unbounded resources productivity is mainly related to technical progress, which is mathematically just a variation of the production function that is unexplained by other factors of production. So with these assumptions, both find that constant consumption per head across generation is possible under certain conditions on the parameters, which are also linked to the magnitude of substitutability and to the magnitude of technical progress. So basically, Solow and Stiglitz have put forward two concepts to support the idea of unbounded resources productivity. As Stiglitz summarizes, two offsetting forces have been identified: technical change and capital accumulation. And so we will now see how technical progress and substitution are understood by these authors. And in fact, important conceptual shortcomings appear when these concepts are related to concrete transformation of the production process, like in the real world, if we can say. So, for example, some illustrations refer rather to substitution between resources than between capital and resources. For example, when Solow mentions the substitution by nuclear or solar energy. So, moreover, this idea of a substitution between natural resources is not consistent with their initial model, where there is only one resource and no alternative resource comes in the model to substitute to the exhaustible one. So here, this idea of substitution is not consistent. The other illustration is less resource-intensive goods by changes in the composition of the output. But once again, the role played by capital in this idea of substitution is not really clear, and this is not even consistent with the model, where the output is just an aggregate production index, where there is no possibilities of, well, at least changes in the composition are not really considered. And the last illustration given by these authors is the case of fuel-saving technologies, which in fact seem at least more consistent with the idea of capital substituting to resources. But the problem here is that this illustration is also used for technical progress. So what we see is that the concepts of substitution and technical progress are somehow overlapping, and that they are not easily considered separately as it is done at the mathematical level in these models. So my suggestion is that these issues come from a model-based methodology, where in fact the model precedes and gives rise to the concepts of the theory. So substitution and technical progress are first mathematical properties of some production functions, and when they are related to actual transformation of the production process in the real world, they reveal inconsistencies. Nevertheless, natural resources economists have kept on asserting that the assumption of unbounded resources productivity was relevant, and they challenge what they call resource pessimists to show that substitution and technical progress do not enable unbounded resources productivity. And among resource pessimists, they included Nicolas Georgescu-Roegen, who who will examine his criticism of natural resources economics now. So, Nicholas Georgescu-Roegen published in 1971 a book called The Entropy Law and the Economic Process, where, among other things, he advocates that thermodynamic laws should be accounted for in economic theory. And he says that from the purely physical point, the economic process is entropic. A few years later, in a paper called Energy and Economic Myths, he uses this approach to criticize the general technological optimism of neoclassical economists. And he mentions for the first time the idea of thermodynamic limits, which would be set by Carnot's theoretical coefficient of efficiency. So a quick reminder for those who are not familiar with this, but basically Sadi Carnot, one of the fathers of thermodynamics, demonstrated that thermal engines have the efficiency of thermal engines has a theoretical maximum, which means that the input of thermal energy cannot be fully transformed into mechanical work by the engine. So, if we look further in, so this first criticism was not specifically addressed to Solow and Stiglitz and the representation of production, but in his comments and papers by Daly and Stiglitz in 1979, he addresses more particularly to the work of Solow and Stiglitz and to the assumption of unbounded resources productivity, and he puts forward two arguments. So first, he says that if capital increases to infinity, then resources will rapidly be exhausted by the production of capital. So here it just emphasizes that capital itself is produced thanks to resources. However, in Solow and Stiglitz models, this is accounted for because capital is just taken on the output, which is itself produced from resources. And this does not prevent capital from increasing to infinity in Solow's model because the productivity of resources increases faster than capital. So this argument seems incomplete and in fact needs to be logically founded on another argument that comes later, and which is the idea of limits to the productivity of resources, where Georgescu-Roegen mentions again that the same service can be provided by a design that requires less matter or energy, but that even in this direction there exists a limit. However, while Carnot's coefficient of efficiency was more related to energy considerations, here we see that Georgescu-Roegen tends to include also material requirements in this idea of thermodynamic limits to the productivity of resources. So what is the methodological foundation of this approach? My suggestion here is that we could call this an interdisciplinary consistency methodology, since Georgescu-Roegen thinks that in order to understand the production process, the theory of production has to be consistent with other disciplines, with other body of knowledge accounting for this for production, and so his methodology ambitions to found concepts and assumptions of the economic theory of production on thermodynamics. So a prospect that I think is somehow shared here, but what's interesting in Georgescu-Roegen approach is that it reveals also the problems, the issues that may arise in such a perspective. And the first important issues is that of the interpretation of thermodynamics, because if we look at how Georgescu-Roegen initially argued for this idea of thermodynamic limits, we see that he links it to the efficiency of energy extraction. That is, to the ratio of the energy extracted over the energy spent in the process. So basically, he didn't use the word at the time, but basically the ROI. And doing this, he says that Carnot's principle implies a theoretical limit to this kind of efficiency. So we see that here his reference to Carnot is somehow misleading because there is no thermal engines implied, so the process is very different, and this justification seems misleading. Another important issue is the fact appears when Georgescu-Roegen makes out now a general thermodynamic limits to the productivity of resources, and in particular in the fact that he doesn't consider the translation from physical to economic variables. So, because while Carnot's principle is used for the transformation of thermal energy into mechanical energy with energy units implied, the idea of limit to the productivity of resources would imply production, which unit is not clearly linked with the units of energy. So the problem of variables is not accounted for by Georgescu-Roegen. So himself didn't really develop more this idea of thermodynamic limits. Just okay. But yes, but Herman Daly brought this idea back 20 years later and triggered a direct confrontation between natural resources economists and ecological economists. So this is what I will briefly study. So in 1997 there was a special issue of the journal Ecological Economics dedicated to Georgescu-Roegen, and on this occasion Herman Daly revived his criticism in a paper called Georgescu-Roegen versus Solow-Stiglitz, which triggered replies from Solow and Stiglitz, and also many commentaries from ecological economists, from other ecological economists and natural resources economists. So Daly's interpretation of Georgescu-Roegen is that Solow and Stiglitz give the appearance of respecting the first law of thermodynamics, material balance, without really doing so. So as we see here, Daly focuses mainly on the idea of on the conservation of mass between the input and the output of the production process, while this idea of while materials were mentioned by Georgescu-Roegen in 1979, as I have also suggested that initially his idea of thermodynamics limits were linked to Carnot's principle, and so rather to the idea of energy and the entropy law. So here again we see that the interpretation of this idea of thermodynamic limits is not really clear and straightforward in ecological economics. If we now regard what is said about the production function, new interesting questions are put forward by the debate. So first, Daly suggests that production functions can only pretend to represent substitution between the existing state of the art and not with future technology, and that this makes the assumption of unbounded resources productivity even more inadequate, because production function will not include future technology. So unfortunately, Solow and Stiglitz didn't really reply to this question of the relation between actual state of the art, improves future technology, and the production function. So the state of the production function relative to this question is not clear. Another important question is whether production is measured in physical or value units. with Daly asserting that even production functions that yield services are producing a physical output, while Stiglitz replies that output is measured not in physical units but in the value of the services associated with it. So these questions once again shows that the notion of production itself needs more conceptual analysis in order to answer these questions, and in particular that the relation between natural resources, the services they provide, and the value of the services is still not conceptually very clear in this controversy. So I don't know. 1 minute. So basically I will not repeat what I have just said here, but what's interesting for me is that these paradigms I've later framed the analysis of sustainability in economics, because for example Solow used the substitutability between man-made capital and natural capital as a whole in order to advocate what we call now weak sustainability perspective, while ecological economists, and in particular Daly, used this idea of limits to substitution to promote the strong sustainability perspective. So this controversy sheds some light on the opposition still relevant between weak and strong sustainability, and on the conceptual issues it may veiculate. And the other important things that appear is that theories and models of production are at the center of preoccupations for sustainability in analysis in economics. And that regarding this, the production function has raised many questions in the controversy, but also ecological economics didn't appear with a clear theoretical alternative to this representation of production. So this invites to study further the theoretical and methodological questions at stake in the representation of production with natural resources. And I thank you for your attention, and I will be glad to have your question.
Okay, Oliver Richters from Oldenburg University. You argue that there has not been much progress within ecological economics also. I think there has been a lot of progress over the last decades, really. Let's only remember the work by Benjamin Warr and Robert Ayers, by Rainer Kümmel, Dietmar Lindenberger, that have continuously worked on precisely developing more realistic production functions with empirical estimation, and that showed that
Should I reply now, or yes? So I am working as another part of my PhD on these works. So the first thing that is important is that they use production functions. So that more or less they have chosen to stay in the neoclassical framework. They just use other production functions, what they call Linux production functions. So I don't. My point is not to criticize this, is to see how this has changed the perspective on the representation of production. And in fact, there are both in this approach. There are both theoretical stakes and also empirical aspects to be studied. So I have no answer right now. What seems interesting is to see how the problems that were raised in this controversy are taken into account in these works and others. So that's what I will intend to do step by step, looking at how different issues are dealt with or not in different perspectives.
Okay. Is there another question? Yes.
And yes, just another point. I didn't say that since then ecological economics has not gone further. My point is very historical, right? I'm not very up to the point on the latest literature in the domain. So my point is to say, look, when these concepts were put forward, there was something, there were some issues, and maybe ask whether these issues have been taken into account now or not.
Dominique Chauvin, prospectivist. You presented the subject of resources with 2 points of view, one which is purely economic and the other one which is ecologic. But my question is about upstream of that, is about the definition of resources, because in both cases you assume that resources is known and is well defined. My question is that even the concept of resources is not very well defined, because taken into account the evolution of thinking and the time, the resources can become a nuisance with the time, which was the resources in the past can become a nuisance. And conversely, you can have some nuisance today, like CO2, for example, which could become resources tomorrow. So on a pure economical point of view, not only you have this divergence of interpretation on throughput, but you have also, in my opinion, an uncertainty about what resources is. Just an example, 20 years ago in my company Total, we decided to compute the reserves of the company, but we decided on a sustainable development point of view to downgrade the reserve, taken into account the reserve which were below the forest or below the town or whatever. And this was not accepted by the management of the company at that time. And presenting a result like that, it was a nonsense for them. But 20 years after, it's become to be a reality. So on a pure economical point of view, the question about resources is an open question.
So yes, I think the situation is a bit different for natural resources economists and ecological economists, because in fact that's what I said. Natural resources economists mainly think about from models, so they don't even really care. If you look at the literature, they don't even really care about what they call resources and what is its importance for economic production, etc. So I think that this is really from the model-based methodology, right? Ecological economics, from their thermodynamic point of view, have pushed further, I guess, the notion of resource and trying to identify more accurately what could be a resource in the long term or in the short term, etc. So the question is a bit different, but yes, the notion of resource itself could be a point of argument.
So we will take 2 more questions.
Yes, thank you for this talk. I'm Gilles Ramstein. I'm just a climate modeler, so I don't know many things about what you say, but it was really clear for me. It was really interesting to and very okay. But I get a question. Maybe it's a very naive question, but you explained very well the difference between natural resources and ecological point of view and changing the prediction function. But for me, when you get a model and some understanding of a system, you may make some prediction that could be better in some framework than on the other. But you never talk about this capability of your model to predict something.
So I think this is related to the first question too, because the question of predictive power of a model or another one is related to the empirical question of confronting these production functions with actual data on energy, capital, labor, etc. So I have put aside this question because, in fact, in this specific corpus, the question is not really dealt with. Usually, Solow and Stiglitz refer to previous work on production functions, and notably by Nordos and Tobin. Sorry, no. and but they don't really deal themselves with the problem. So trying to separate the different aspects of the question. I have been focusing on the theoretical stakes here, and I'm working on the empirical aspects of production functions with energy resources in other part of my work. But as I said before, this is a work in progress, and I would not pretend to state now what I think on this question. But it's the other side of the question.
Coming back to your resource issue, let me phrase this question slightly different. Can you think of a single resource we don't have a substitute for? For example, fossil energy, we could go to lithium and deuterium and do fusion. We could go to solar energy, and those are substitutes then as well. And if you really don't have anything we couldn't substitute, then the question is, at what time scale is that a resource runs out relevant? Is it 200 years? Because technology changes an awful lot in 200 years. I mean, if you told me that the only thing we have is coal, I'd be very worried about running out of energy. But if I can substitute renewable energies, maybe we are worrying about the wrong thing.
Yes, but what was interesting for me is that
Please let
you
the
may.
speaker answer the question.
But what's interesting here is that this question of transition and of substitution between resources is in fact not on the table at the time, because as we see when Solo and Stiglitz developed their first model, they are not considering at all substitution between resources. No, but it's not substitution between resources, it's substitution between capital and resources. So even if this notion, the problem is that even this notion is not really clear in the mind of natural resources economists. And that's all I meant. I didn't say that there is no substitution between resources possible. I just said, look at how economists think of this issue and look at these conceptual problems that appear in what they call substitution and what they call technical progress. That's all my point. I never said that substitution by other resources is not possible.
Well,
That's okay?
Thank you. Yes, thank you.